Berlin, April 16, 1945. The once proud capital of the Third Reich was now a shadow of its former self. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were riddled with craters from relentless Allied bombardment, and the air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of burning. From the Soviet side, the Red Army advanced in overwhelming force. Over 1 million troops were moving toward the city center, tanks and artillery pounding the outskirts into submission. For the German soldiers and civilians trapped inside, hope was nearly gone. Captain Klaus Richter, a 29-year-old officer of the Volkssturm, patrolled the shattered streets of Friedrichshain with a handful of poorly trained boys and old men pressed into service. Most of his men were teenagers or men too old for regular army service, armed with a mix of rifles, pistols, and captured weapons. The night before, Richter had walked through the ruins of the Tiergarten, witnessing families huddled in basements, their faces pale from fear and hunger. The German command had promised reinforcements, but none were coming. Supplies were gone, ammunition scarce, and morale crumbling. From the west, the sound of artillery shook the city. Every building Richter passed looked like a tomb, walls riddled with bullets, windows blown out, roofs collapsed. A car burned at the corner of a street, black smoke curling into the overcast sky. "Keep moving!" Richter shouted to his small squad. "Every street, every building, hold it as long as we can!" But even as he gave orders, he knew they were meaningless against the tidal wave of Soviet armor and infantry approaching from all sides. By dawn, Soviet artillery began pounding the city indiscriminately. Shells tore through apartment buildings, flipping rubble into the streets, crushing cars, and sending fireballs into the sky. The noise was deafening, a relentless cacophony of destruction. Civilians screamed from basements, their voices echoing through the ruined streets. Mothers clutched their children, old men prayed aloud, and the young boys of the Volkssturm trembled with terror, some crying openly. Richter led his men into a narrow alley, hoping to avoid the advancing tanks. They ducked into a partially destroyed school building, the walls still standing just enough to offer cover. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the floor littered with papers, broken desks, and rubble. A young soldier, barely 16, whispered, "Captain, they're everywhere. I think they're going to kill us all." Richter did not answer. His jaw was tight. He scanned the shattered street through a broken window and saw the red banners of the Red Army advancing, flags waving over burning buildings. He could feel the inevitability of what was coming. Hours later, the first Soviet scouts entered the district. They moved like shadows through the smoke, rifles ready, eyes sharp. Richter's men fired their last rounds, a brief burst of defiance against an unstoppable force. One of his oldest men, barely able to lift a rifle, fell to a Soviet grenade. The firefight lasted only minutes. By noon, the building was surrounded. Richter ordered his remaining men to retreat deeper into the ruins, ducking through back alleys and collapsing streets. As he ran, he passed the Brandenburg Gate, a symbol of Germany's pride, now scorched and battered. Soviet tanks rumbled past it, their cannons gleaming, the soldiers on top cheering, waving red flags. For a brief moment, Richter paused. He wanted to remember what the city had been, before Hitler, before war, before destruction. But there was no time for memory. The fight continued. Every building became a fortress, every street a death trap. Richter and his men engaged in house-to-house combat, firing from windows, crouching behind ruined walls, throwing grenades into enemy positions. The Soviets pressed on relentlessly, their numbers overwhelming. In the chaos, Richter witnessed the human cost of the final days. Families huddled in basements, some executed by desperate German soldiers fearing deserters, others caught in indiscriminate artillery fire. Children screamed for their parents. The streets ran with snow-streaked blood. By nightfall, Richter's squad was reduced to just 3 men. Ammunition was gone. Hunger gnawed at them. Exhaustion made every movement painful. Yet they pressed on, trying to reach a government building still thought to be defended by remnants of the German command. Outside, the city burned brighter than any Christmas tree. Fires illuminated the night sky, casting long shadows across shattered streets. The sound of Soviet artillery never ceased. Each shelling shook Richter to his core, each explosion carving away another piece of the city, another piece of hope. As he paused behind a fallen lamppost, Richter looked up at the blackened skyline. The Reichstag loomed in the distance, a symbol of what Hitler had built, and what the Red Army was determined to destroy. He whispered to his remaining men, "We hold for now, but I fear the end is near." In the shadows of the ruined city, civilians and soldiers alike realized the same terrifying truth: Berlin was lost. Germany's final days had begun. April 17, 1945. The streets of Berlin had become a living nightmare. Rubble lined every road. Smoke choked the air, and the occasional crack of gunfire echoed endlessly through shattered buildings. For the remaining defenders of the city, every step was a gamble between life and death. Captain Klaus Richter and his surviving men moved cautiously through Friedrichstrasse, the once bustling boulevard now reduced to ruins. Tanks lay twisted in craters, bodies frozen in unnatural positions beneath snow and ash. Richter's eyes scanned every broken doorway, expecting ambush at every turn. "Keep your heads low," he whispered. "Every shadow could be the end." They passed a collapsed building and heard faint cries from inside. Richter pushed open the rubble and found two children, shivering, their mother bleeding on the floor nearby. With no time for medical aid, he handed the children his scarf and whispered, "Stay quiet. Stay alive." The Red Army was everywhere. Soviet infantry advanced in waves, moving with terrifying coordination, their artillery pounding the streets relentlessly. Even the old Volkssturm defenders had little chance. Most were killed before they could even raise their rifles. By mid-morning, Richter's small squad reached a strategic intersection near the Tiergarten, a sector partially defended by remnants of the Wehrmacht and SS units. A few barricades still held, but the streets were open for tanks to fire at anything that moved. Suddenly, the first Soviet T-34 tanks appeared, their engines growling as they pushed down the street, crushing cars and debris beneath their tracks. The men fired the last of their Panzerfaust rounds. One tank erupted in flames, a brief victory, but two more rolled forward unstoppable. Civilians fled into the alleys, some tripping over rubble, others frozen in fear. Richter dragged a young soldier behind a collapsed wall. "Aim low," he ordered. "Take them out before they get close." Machine gun fire tore through the streets. Windows shattered as bullets ripped through walls. The smell of cordite and burning metal filled every corner. Richter's squad fought desperately, knowing every second bought them, and the civilians, a fleeting chance at survival. Hours turned into a nightmare of moving from cover to cover. They encountered a German officer, delirious and armed, firing at anyone he saw, shouting about orders that no longer mattered. Richter intervened, taking control of the situation, but the officer's death left a bitter taste. Loyalty, fear, and desperation had collided in a way only the final days of a losing war could produce. By evening, Richter's men were reduced to just himself, two young boys and a medic. Exhaustion was written on every face. Blood, soot, and frost formed crusts on their uniforms. Yet, the Red Army continued its push, relentless and overwhelming. A distant explosion shook the ground. The Reichstag had come into view, its massive walls scarred from artillery and air raids. Soviet soldiers were beginning their approach, storming through streets lined with barricades, firing indiscriminately. Richter whispered to his men, "We make our stand here. We stop them, or we die trying." The building they chose to hold was a partially destroyed apartment complex overlooking a crossroad. From here, they had a clear line of fire on the advancing Soviet infantry. Mortars had been silenced days ago. Only rifles, Panzerfausts, and desperation remained. Night fell. Fires burned across the city, turning the snow red. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and fear. Through shattered windows, Richter's men fired at anything moving, counting kills silently, their hearts pounding. Suddenly, grenades rained down the stairwell. Richter pulled two survivors into a corner as an explosion ripped the floor above them. Dust filled the room. When it settled, only Richter and the medic remained. The boys had been struck, thrown into the rubble. Richter barely had time to mourn. There was no time. The Reichstag loomed closer, its walls defiant against the tide of the Red Army. Smoke and fire marked every street. Screams of dying soldiers and terrified civilians blended into one unending howl of despair. By dawn, Soviet soldiers had infiltrated nearby streets. Richter's last Panzerfaust was spent. He and the medic fired rifles until their barrels glowed red, taking down anyone who approached. Finally, a grenade landed directly in their position. Richter was thrown across the room, barely conscious. The medic, pinned under debris, reached for his hand. Their eyes met, two survivors of a city that was dying around them. The Red Army entered the building. Richter raised his hands. The battle was over for them. But the city itself, Berlin, was still engulfed in flames. In the streets outside, bodies lay frozen in snow, civilians huddled in basements, and soldiers, German and Soviet alike, moved through ruin. The Third Reich's capital had fallen, yet chaos reigned. Richter's thoughts drifted to his family, his home, a life that felt impossibly far away. He had survived, but the cost was almost too high to bear. The world he knew, the country he had served, had crumbled around him. As Soviet banners rose over the Reichstag, and the sun illuminated the devastated city, Richter understood the truth. The war in Europe was ending, but the human cost would echo forever. April 20, 1945. Berlin's streets had become rivers of rubble and fire. Smoke spiraled endlessly into the gray sky, obscuring the sun. Buildings that had once been proud monuments to German power now stood as hollowed-out shells. The city was a graveyard. Captain Klaus Richter, battered and exhausted, led his last remaining men toward the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany. Tanks had already breached the outer perimeter, and Soviet troops were pressing through the adjacent streets. Richter knew that holding any ground was now meaningless. Survival was the only currency left. "Stick together," he whispered. "No one gets left behind." They moved through shattered streets where corpses lay frozen in unnatural poses. A bakery, once filled with the aroma of bread, was now a ruin, a burnt oven, shattered windows, and walls blackened with soot. Richter stepped over a child's frozen body, tears stinging his eyes. War had no mercy here. The Reichstag loomed above them, its towering walls scarred from artillery, its roof partially collapsed. Soviet artillery shells continued to crash around the building, shaking the streets, sending debris tumbling down. Smoke and fire illuminated the shattered windows, casting eerie shadows across the battlefield. Inside, German soldiers and Hitler Youth had barricaded themselves. The building's interior was a maze of corridors, offices, and chambers. Richter's squad entered cautiously, rifles ready, senses heightened. Every room could hide a sniper, a mine, or a desperate soldier willing to die. "Check every corner," Richter ordered. "Move slow." The floors creaked beneath them. Dust and plaster rained from shattered ceilings. In one chamber, they found a group of civilians, mostly women and children, huddled together, praying. Their eyes wide with fear, they clung to each other as Richter gestured for them to stay low. "Don't move," he said quietly. "We're here to survive, not to hurt you." The firefight began in earnest near the central hall. Soviet soldiers stormed the main chamber, using grenades and machine guns to push through barricades. German defenders responded with deadly precision, firing from stairwells and windows. Richter's squad joined the chaos, taking down anyone who came close. Through the smoke and confusion, he witnessed acts of unimaginable desperation. A German officer, realizing the end was near, ignited a stockpile of explosives in a last, futile attempt to destroy the Reichstag from within. Richter dove behind a collapsed wall as the blast tore through the floor, sending shards of metal and concrete flying like deadly rain. Hours passed in a blur. Each room was a new battlefield. The Reichstag had become a fortress of death, filled with echoes of screams, gunfire, and explosions. Richter and his men fired until their rifles glowed, until the last rounds were gone. By late afternoon, the Soviets had reached the main hall. Barricades had been smashed, floors torn apart. The German defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, were falling one by one. Richter moved cautiously through the hall, stepping over bodies and debris. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and death. At last, the Soviet flag was raised atop the Reichstag. The building, the very symbol of Hitler's empire, had fallen. Soldiers cheered outside, some weeping, some laughing, others too exhausted to react. Richter, standing amidst the ruins, looked around. His squad was gone, the two young boys, the medic, all fallen in the chaos. Only he remained, wounded, bloodied, and hollow-eyed. He stumbled to a shattered window and looked out at the city. Berlin burned on every street, yet the red banners of the Red Army waved above the destruction. "It's over," he whispered. "It has to be over." Yet even as he said it, Richter knew the human cost. Tens of thousands of civilians trapped in the rubble, countless soldiers dead, and the psychological scars that would last a lifetime. Victory had come at a price almost too high to imagine. In the days that followed, Berlin descended further into chaos. Looting, executions, and desperate attempts to flee filled the streets. Richter wandered through the ruins, helping civilians find shelter, sharing rations where he could, and marking the names of the fallen in his notebook, a record for those who might remember what had happened. By the end of April, the Reichstag stood as both a symbol of triumph for the Allies and a monument to human suffering. Hitler's empire was collapsing, and the final days of the Third Reich had left Berlin in ashes. Captain Klaus Richter, one man among thousands, realized that the war was ending, but the scars of Berlin's destruction would echo for generations. The city was free, but the cost of freedom had been staggering. And in the streets and ruins, shadows of the fallen whispered the stories of a people who had survived, barely, the final days of Germany's empire. April 30th, 1945. The heart of Berlin was silent, almost. Smoke curled from burning buildings, and the acrid smell of rubble filled the air. The city that had once embodied Hitler's vision of power now lay in ruins, its streets a labyrinth of death and despair. Captain Klaus Richter wandered through Friedrichstrasse, the weight of exhaustion pressing on him like a physical force. The Red Army controlled the city, but chaos reigned. Looters scavenged through the wreckage. Fires flared unexpectedly. The cries of the wounded echoed from cellars and basements, blending with distant gunfire. Richter paused in front of a collapsed apartment building. A family huddled in the corner, faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Mothers clutched their children, and an old man whispered prayers in a trembling voice. Richter handed them a piece of bread from his dwindling rations. "Stay together," he said softly. "Stay alive." Across the street, Soviet soldiers moved cautiously, securing areas block by block. Some were stoic, others visibly weary, and a few glanced at the civilians with pity. They were victors, yes, but the city offered little glory, only ruin. In the government district, remnants of Nazi officials had barricaded themselves in bunkers, trying desperately to escape. Rumors circulated of Hitler's suicide in the Führer bunker. The city was leaderless, directionless, and crumbling from within. Richter's remaining squad, now just himself and a medic, moved toward the Reich Chancellery. They avoided streets where snipers were active and crept past barricades still defended by die-hard fanatics who refused surrender. Every corner was a gamble. Every doorway a potential ambush. By late morning, they reached the Reich Chancellery courtyard. The flags of the Red Army waved proudly above the ruins. The German defenders had largely surrendered or been eliminated. For Richter, the sight was surreal, the very seat of power now in the hands of the enemy. Inside the Chancellery, the halls were eerily quiet. Desks lay overturned. Portraits of Hitler had been torn from walls. The air smelled of smoke, mildew, and decay. Richter found a small room where a few civilian staff remained, trembling as Soviet soldiers passed outside. He offered water, comfort, and a whispered assurance. "It's over. You're safe now." The day stretched on. Berlin's streets slowly filled with survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, emerging from basements, cellars, and ruins. Faces were pale, eyes hollow, hands shaking. They wandered aimlessly, some crying, others silent, trying to comprehend what remained of their world. Richter looked at a group of children huddled near a destroyed fountain. Their parents were gone. Their homes were gone. And yet, in their eyes, a spark remained, the will to survive. He handed them a loaf of bread and a can of preserved food he had scavenged. "Eat," he said. "You'll need your strength." As night fell, Berlin lay quiet for the first time in weeks. Fires still burned, but the artillery had stopped. The battle was over. Richter walked through the streets alone, counting the cost in his mind: thousands dead, countless wounded, and the complete destruction of a city that had once stood as the heart of a regime. He reached the Reichstag, still smoldering from the assault. The Soviet flag flew atop the roof. Through the shattered windows, Richter saw the frozen remnants of a final stand, German defenders who had died holding the symbol of their fallen empire. "History will remember this," he whispered. "Not for what we built, but for what we lost." For the next few days, Richter assisted civilians, helped bury the dead, and marked the names of fallen comrades in his notebook, a silent record of survival, courage, and loss. April 30th also marked the end of Hitler's life. Word spread quickly, and the already shattered morale of the remaining German soldiers evaporated. Surrenders increased. Families emerged from hiding. The city, while still dangerous and devastated, began a tentative journey toward peace. Richter paused in the middle of Unter den Linden Boulevard. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting off broken glass and twisted metal. Birds cautiously returned to the city, a subtle reminder that life could continue. He thought of his fallen squadmates, the civilians he had tried to save, and the countless lives destroyed in Berlin's final days. The victory of the Allies was clear, but it was bittersweet. The city was a ghost of itself, and the human cost was immeasurable. As Richter finally rested in a makeshift shelter, he realized that war leaves scars that time cannot erase. He had survived the fall of Berlin, but he carried with him memories of fire, blood, and courage. The Third Reich had collapsed. Berlin lay in ruins. And from the shadows of destruction, the survivors would rise, forever changed, forever marked by the city that had fallen and the world that had been forever altered.